In composition, I was sort of a late bloomer. I didn't get started until actually when I returned from the Army, and I was just out of Vietnam, just got back from Vietnam, decided to go back to school, and I had already had a bachelor's degree from University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh, and decided to go back to school and worked on my master's. In between that time, when I was working on my master's, I got a job at public school teaching middle school. And during that time, I took a master's class in composition, and it was a piece that really changed my life. And my teacher said, you really have talent, you have to go on into composition. So before that time, my goal was to be a band conductor. Before I went to Michigan State, I got permission to write a band piece for my thesis instead of writing a traditional paper for my master's thesis. This piece turned into my first published composition because at Michigan State, when we got there, we had annual New Music for Winds conferences. And that was another experience in my life that sort of changed my thinking about composition. And it was a good piece of music. It didn't have a whole lot of percussion in it. It wasn't until after my 3 years at Spring Arbor University that when I got the job at Central Michigan University, I met the percussion director there, Robert Hohner. And then he twisted my arm and said, you've got to write something for percussion ensemble. And quite frankly, I'd never heard a percussion ensemble before. I didn't know there was such a thing as a percussion ensemble. I really didn't. And then I heard Robert Hohner's percussion ensemble, which was a huge force of instruments, 10, 12 players playing all these marimbas and xylophones and vibraphones and this huge battery of auxiliary instruments, just wonderful sounds. And I started writing this percussion ensemble, which I wanted to base on something. I love Gregorian chant, so I based it on this Victime Pascali Laudis, and so I call it Pascal Dances. And it's just a set of dances and episodes based on this old chant. And the funny thing about, well, maybe it's not funny, but the interesting thing about this piece is I tried to get everything into this piece that I had heard in the past that was happening in the percussion world. A huge conglomeration of percussion colors. And it turned out to be a pretty successful piece. Owner was just a really nice person to work with. I mean, he was very, very helpful. So I was asking questions at least every day, and I'd say, can you do this, or what about this? And he says, no, you want to do this. And he says, don't be afraid to use more than one marimba. Don't be afraid. So it ended up with like 3 marimbas in this piece. Of course, these were the days when we didn't have the 5-octave marimbas. But Bob had a lot of instruments. It seemed like whatever I wanted, he would get somehow. But so I wasn't really limited by any particular instruments. Of course, I didn't think of things like tuned gongs or any exotic type instruments or things like that. But Bob would constantly say, well, crotales are really nice, and or this combination is really nice, and it was a great collaboration between composer and he didn't actually commission the piece, but I could say kind of composer commissioner. But it was a really nice experience. Pascal Dances changed my writing career in another way, because prior to Pascal Dances, the pieces for band that I was writing took on a flavor of a lot of wind players, woodwinds and brass, and sort of the percussion being an afterthought. After you get done with the winds in the piece, then you start thinking, gosh, should I have some sort of percussion instruments in this piece? Maybe bass drum, snare drum, crash cymbals, and timpani. And that was in my mind as percussion instruments. Now, after writing Pascal Dances, my whole thinking changed, and I'm thinking, so I talked to Bob and I say, well, do people write for the band this way? I mean, can I use these kind of forces in the band? He says, oh yeah, that's fine. And I thought, well, what am I doing? I'm just going about this wrong. So in between this piece and the next percussion piece, I wrote a piece called Heroes Lost and Fallen, which was a commission by the Ann Arbor Community Band. And this, a lot of people consider as my signature piece. There's at least 5 percussion in this piece, and a huge conglomeration, deluge of percussion instruments, particularly keyboard instruments. And thereafter, practically all the band pieces I've written, it's a stereotypical Gillingham thing that there's going to be a lot of keyboard percussion in the piece. So anyway, the advent of Heroes Lost and Fallen led me to the next percussion piece. Actually, Pascal Dances was getting some performances, and in particular, a percussion director at the University of Utah, Doug Wolf, got a hold of this piece, performed it, and really, really liked it. And he had a very prolific percussion program at University of Utah. And he called me, he says, we want to commission you to write a percussion piece of about the same forces that you used in Pascal Dances, about 12 players or so. And I came up with this idea. I like pieces that have some kind of a programmatic element. This piece really doesn't tell a story, but it has different moods in it. Now, I was always wanted to name a piece Stained Glass. I thought that was a really neat title for a musical piece. And then I thought, well, how am I going to organize it? Well, you have to think about different ways of using stained glass. So the first movement I called Foyers. Like in the foyers of large mansions, you might have some stained glass in the entryway. So it has kind of an abstract quality about it. It starts with the marimbas doing kind of a little pattern between 6/8 and 2/4, and it's just an ostinato pattern. And then there's kind of an angular melody that comes in, and there's a lot of interaction between the drums and the auxiliary instruments and so forth. But it's sort of an entrance type piece, but it segues into the second movement, which is cathedrals, and all the kind of the references in my mind to cathedrals. You'll hear sort of right at the very beginning, a very obvious reference are church bells. And when I was a kid growing up in my church, in my Methodist church back in Wisconsin, there was a bell ringer that actually rang bells in the church, and they were on ropes. And so you'd start ringing those bells, and they would start randomly. The 2 bells would ring randomly. One would ring at a different speed of the other. So I thought, how can I emulate that sort of thing. And I remembered a piece by one of my teachers, H. Owen Reed. His La Fiesta Mexicana has a second movement where there are bells ringing and they're random like. And that segues into kind of a very ethereal sound. I've used crystal glasses, 4 crystal glasses, with the players rubbing on the crystal glasses. So you get this real eerie sound. It's just there. It's you listen, you say, whoa, what is this sound? And so that's sort of a backdrop. Then you hear the 2 marimba players playing very organ-like, very church-like modal passages. And that's a reference to organ music. And then this segues into an ostinato pattern in the piano. And this continues on, and then there's sort of chords going back and forth between marimbas and vibraphones. And the vibraphones use the slow motor, and so we get sort of an ethereal effect that way. And then the end of the piece goes into another ostinato by the piano. And there's a timpani roll that goes into the last movement, which really takes over the ostinato and kind of wipes out all the religious connotations. And then all of a sudden, we're in this really, really bright, flashy third movement, which I call sun catchers. And sun catchers are all different types of stained glass in shapes and so forth, birds and hummingbirds, that sort of thing, and you hang them in your window, and they catch the sun, and they bounce off, and the sun radiates off that stained glass. And there's a melody in the xylophone that comes through that uses the Lydian mode, and I think the Lydian mode is probably the brightest scale pattern that we have in Western music. So it's just as bright as can be. It's in E major, seems to permeate the whole mood. And when I think of E major, I think of yellow, which is a very bright color. So that permeates the whole movement. And then it comes to just a rousing conclusion at the end with glissandos in the keyboard instruments. My thoughts on what makes stained glass and maybe Pascal Dances different than some other percussion ensemble music. You have to understand that when I first met Robert Hohner, that was my first big exposure to percussion ensemble music. So before I wrote this piece, I heard a lot of Bob's concerts. So I heard, some percussion music. And of course, Ionization sticks in my mind, which was a classic percussion piece. But a lot of the pieces that I heard, to me as a composer, were dominated by a lot of the membrane instruments and maybe metallic sounds and things like that. And I didn't think were organized necessarily like pieces of music that I was accustomed to hearing. Like if I were to go to a symphony concert and I heard a symphony by Sibelius or a symphony by Beethoven, there's, it's very well structured. There's a melody, a subordinate melody, a development section, and a return, and that sort of thing. And I thought, jeepers, if this is a viable ensemble, just like a brass ensemble or a woodwind ensemble or a string ensemble, why can't the percussion ensemble, why can't we organize the music that way? And I think being such a melodic person myself, it would be hard for me to write a piece that was just bass drums, metallic sounds, cowbells, and things like that, which are great sounds, just great sounds. But for me, I feel like my hands are tied, that I need instruments that I can express harmony with and also melody. So I was drawn to all the keyboard sounds of pieces that used a lot of the keyboards. I was gravitated toward that. So perhaps that's why these pieces are different than something that preceded. I'm not saying there wasn't any melody in those pieces, but I heard a lot of pieces that were just based on different sounds, organizations of different sounds, not sounds that have any definite pitch. And I'm thinking, here are marimbas, beautiful instrument, and vibraphones, and put those together. And then you've got the xylophone on the top, which is like a piccolo, and you've got your crotales, they work the same way, and the bells, just these shimmering sounds. I love the shimmering sounds of the metallic instruments. So perhaps that's why it had maybe a more profound effect, and maybe that's what the draw is to that piece. Maybe the draw is the sound, or maybe the draw is the melody. As I mentioned before, Pascal Dances really was career-changing for me as far as my writing for band. So all of my band pieces following Pascal Dances and, of course, Stained Glass started taking on a much different flavor. And probably that helped me as a band composer, because there was a stereotypical expectation of band directors and university directors that when they know my music, they say, well, we're going to get a lot of percussion. There's going to be a lot of keyboard percussion in it. So it took on that flavor. And I didn't do that just to keep the players busy. I didn't do that. It was just because I was so in love with the timbre of the percussion section, and it's not only the keyboard instruments, but other combinations of instruments. And I would constantly, and students in the percussion studio would know that I was very interested. They kept me abreast of everything new that was coming out in percussion. And I still think it's sort of the last frontier in music. I mean, they invent instruments. They start bowing on every instrument that you can possibly think of. So all my band pieces took on just more percussion color. If I was writing something that had some limitations, like maybe a grade 3 level band piece, I had to be careful with what I used in percussion. But I still challenged myself and tried to challenge the people that were commissioning me to write the piece to say, well, look, I'd like to at least use the piano in this piece, and I'd also like to use the vibraphone, and I'd like to use a couple break drums, that sort of thing. So my band music just took on that flavor. A little bit later in the 90s, I was asked to write a piece by Joe Missel at Oklahoma State University. And so somehow I started thinking 4 players. And I sort of visualized them in front of the ensemble somehow. But I thought, how many instruments can each one of these players play, and how much room will we have in front of the ensemble? So the piece developed along, and the problem I had with this piece was I could not think of a title for the piece. I thought of all sorts of titles, like The Abyss or something like that, or something Darkness into Sunlight or something like that. I just could not come up with a title. So I finally settled upon something that's a little bit more classical or more musical. And I thought, well, this is sort of a mini concerto because it is featuring the percussion instruments. So I thought, well, Concertino is like a miniature concerto. But I didn't want to just call it Concertino, so the longer name came about, Concertino for 4 percussion and wind ensemble. But it was a really, really fun piece to write, and Joe Missel premiered it over in Austria, and I have I love playing the recording of that piece, mainly because there's a few seconds at the end of the piece where you don't hear any clapping, and then you hear a burst of applause and everybody just yelling and screaming. So, and I could play that like 1,000 times and never get sick of it. So since all these pieces I've written for band and Pascal Dances and Stained Glass, I've got something like 14 percussion ensemble pieces in the repertoire. And if it were up to me, I'd be writing one of these pieces every other month. And I'm sure if it were up to my publisher, I'd probably be writing one every other week, because they're just really fun pieces to write. I've got a lot of colleagues, composers, that say, "Oh, I've never written for percussion ensemble. I don't like all that hammering, and I don't like all that rolling on the marimba." And I'm thinking, wow, you just haven't experienced anything if you haven't written for a percussion ensemble, especially a large percussion ensemble. The musical possibilities are just as great and just unlimited with a percussion ensemble as they are with any other ensemble. I think of it as sort of a small wind ensemble working with percussion ensemble. So it's just great. Lately, I've written a couple more pieces. Interesting story. The one piece is called Whirlwind, and the other piece is called Angels of the Apocalypse. A Japanese high school ensemble approached me to write a piece. Actually, this was all done through translation, through the internet, through email, and they wanted me to write a piece. And my publisher and I had talked about doing a percussion piece sometimes that had some sort of a perpetual motion in it, some kind of a continuous motion all the way through with other things happening. So I had that perpetual motion idea in my head. So I started out to write a perpetual motion piece. Whirlwind is this perpetual motion, 16th notes practically all the way through. And my favorite mode creeps into this, the Lydian mode. Actually, it's a Lydian mode kind of combined with the Mixolydian mode. So I have several motives that permeate this piece. There's a fast motive, and then there's kind of a slower motive. But all the way through, this motor keeps running of these 16th notes from beginning to end. And unfortunately, there's not a rest for a lot of the players. So I thought this was going to be a wonderful piece for the Japanese players. And so we sent it off, and I waited about a week, and then I started getting these emails saying, well, Mr. So-and-so, it wasn't quite the piece that they wanted. It wasn't, they didn't mention the word easy, but they want something that's a little more flashy, something that they can take and they can really bring down the house at festival. I said, okay, all right, I'll write a flashy piece. So I tried to put everything I possibly could into this next piece, and I thought, I'm going to have a programmatic idea around this one. So I thought of the last, the book of the Bible, Revelation, and all these, the horrible things that happen when the world comes to an end, the apocalypse. And then these 7 angels appear, and each one, after all these plagues and all these awful things happen, and finally it ends, you see this utopia that happens at the very end. And it's an incredibly hard piece. I thought, okay, I'm going to pull out all the stops. And I thought Whirlwind was challenging in itself, but like I said, they really want all the stops pulled out. So I came up with a very programmatic piece that they're just working really, really hard. There's lots of notes, a gazillion notes in every measure. I mean, it's just a hard piece, but it's very programmatic. It's very harmonically organized, very harmonically stereotypical of a lot of my music, chromatic mediant progressions and so forth. And it's a good piece. It was an interesting experience, because you do not have the collaboration like you have somebody. You have the barrier of translation, the Japanese language and the English language, and that's what it was. It was just a misunderstanding of which direction I could go, because I could have gone in that direction at first. But that's the latest project, and I can't wait to get to the next percussion ensemble. If a band piece doesn't get in the way, I'd like to write another large percussion ensemble of the forces of stained glass or Pascal Dances.